Just 10 minutes.
Thank you, Kim Corlett. Minister, the third interim report was met with acute dissatisfaction from survivors, their families and their supporters. These are people who have been failed by the state, by religious denominations and by the entire establishment in this country. For them, the treatment of lone parents, of unmarried mothers and of poor parents, by the way, their only crime in the county homes was in many cases because they were homeless or in poverty. But for them, this isn't a historic event, it's a lived reality. And mothers were institutionalised, children were institutionalised, families were split up. The mother and baby homes were the product of misogynistic, conservative establishment that ran this state for decades. Now, the extension of time for the final report by a year is particularly difficult for all of these survivors who are elderly and who are seeking answers to many of the questions that they have. Now, I am not dismissing and diminishing the fact that there's real problems and complexities faced by the Commission and its staff. For example, the volume of people who are now contacting the Commission to give their testimonies, and many of these people still haven't been met. The Confidential Committee has met hundreds of residents all over the country and also in Britain. And this is down to the fact that attitudes have changed in this country and that more and more women in particular are feeling they can come forward and speak about their treatment in these institutions. So many have still to meet the Commission. The second reason that's given is the fact that these are old records, many of which are paper files, and the location or existence of some is uncertain. The interim report outlines how there's a major administrative task in processing these records and in manually examining them as well. And I think a third issue is the still extensive information to come in from religious congregations that have been served with discovery orders, and also state departments that have been served with discovery orders. What level of non-cooperation has the Commission met from some religious institutions? That has to be answered, because it's absolutely disgraceful if that is going on and is delaying. I'm not saying it's the only issue, but if it's any cause for further delay to this process. Now, while acknowledging that these are real problems and issues, the position is still totally unsatisfactory for survivors, and I think that there are things that can be done in the interim. Survivors need to get a comprehensive, well-researched, definitive report at the end of the process, but there's also a need for them to receive an apology from the state and from the religious denominations. That does not need to wait until the end of this Commission. A lot of survivors on social media and elsewhere have been commenting and wondering why the state is paying for a visit by the Pope at a time when they haven't had redress from the religious organisations that abuse them, and they haven't had an apology from the Church. It's been a very big issue that's been raised by people. 20 million is estimated to be spent by the state on this visit. And according to the Archbishop of Dublin, I don't know how much, if the Church is coughing up for any of it. That's 3 times the budget that's reported for this Commission, which is reported at 7 million. So, Minister, I think it's legitimate to ask, can we not beef up the budget? Can we take on more staff? I'm sure that there's students, historians, researchers of all kinds that would love to work on this project, love to be part of, given closure to many of the people in this situation. So over the next year we need to make sure the Commission has further interim and progress reports, and if there's areas that it can make conclusions on, it should do that. And I absolutely agree that redress scheme could be set up for elderly people in particular to avail of. We don't want to be in a position, by the way, next year where this report does come and then there's a delay in setting up a redress scheme. Moves can be made to do that now. And I think as well that, having made the point that societal attitudes are driving the correct call by survivors for redress and how women feel freer to speak, that those who those who have been adopted should also feel free to speak about their experience and how the institutions have impacted on them. Now, last week in this chamber, we spoke on the 100th anniversary of the right of women to vote. It was marked by the state. But at the same time women were being granted the right to vote, they were having their rights taken away from them in whole other areas of life. There was a counter-revolution taking place against women's rights when this state was established. So we saw women getting the right to vote but being taken off juries. We saw women getting the right to vote but being denied contraception until the 1970s. The right to a divorce was actually removed as a right in this country and only won back in the 1990s. In the past 25 years, there has been a transformation in attitudes and in the role of women in Irish society, much of it driven by the increased number of women in the workforce. So, at the time when some of these mother and baby homes were still open, for example in 1973, only 15% of married women worked, and today that figure is obviously hugely increased. The participation of women has risen by 42 to 63% overall in the workforce. 34% of women have a third-level qualification, 28% of men. The pay gap, however, has remained for women. And I suppose the key point that I'm getting at is that while we get redress for people who are in the mother and baby homes, the time is up now for the oppression of women in this country in general. And because the mother and baby homes were sustained by a hostile attitude to women's sexuality, to women's value in society, the Church and the State colluded to have institutions as the sanction that would be taken against women who didn't conform to the role model of the time and to having children only within wedlock. Women were to be the providers of free domestic labour at this time. We see that in the institutions where their work was unpaid. And as we're going into a referendum which will deal with primarily the rights of women over their own bodies, you know, parties and individuals should be consistent, because this is very much linked with, for example, we should end shaming women's sexuality, and we should also recognise that women with crisis pregnancy should be allowed to make their own decisions, which they weren't at this time. It's very involved with the referendum that's about to take place on abortion. And I think in 2013, for example, it's quite amazing that the Pharmaceutical Society was given the power to sign off on regulations where the personal moral standards of a pharmacist could result in a woman being denied emergency contraception, a case highlighted only last week, where, you know, within the last 4 years there was a 14-year jail sentence brought in for use of the abortion pill or for having an abortion. Just last year, the government saw fit to turn over the ownership of the National Maternity Hospital to one of the religious institutions that is facing, you know, accusations and is responsible for abuse and for institutional abuse, only reversed because of a major public backlash. And we still have, you know, politicians extremely far behind on these issues. Today, in finishing, we have a transformed attitude to women. 1 in 4 families are now one-parent families, and it's absolutely time that this redress was given to all of those who were victims of this repressive attitude by Church and State to women. Everything should be done in terms of resources to see that this process is met by next year, because I think if there was any delay, it would cause, you know, an absolute revolt or outcry and be a huge kick in the teeth to people who've already been victimised by this state.